She walked into the restaurant expecting nothing more than a meal, but left a life-changing lesson behind. Disrespected by the waiter for no reason other than the color of her skin, her unexpected $1,000 tip didn't just shock the staff. It exposed a hidden truth no one was ready for. But before we start, what's your spirit animal? Let us know in the comments. The afternoon sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the bustling city streets. Inside a high-end restaurant, the sounds of clinking silverware and soft murmurs filled the air, blending seamlessly with the elegance that defined the space. Marble floors gleamed beneath the dimmed chandeliers, while impeccably dressed waiters moved with precision between tables. The atmosphere was one of luxury, of exclusivity, and for those fortunate enough to dine here, of entitlement. At the entrance, the door opened with a soft chime, and in walked the woman who would soon become the center of an unforgettable story. She moved with grace, her presence commanding attention without demanding it. Dressed in a tailored suit of deep emerald green that complemented her rich brown skin, she exuded a quiet confidence that spoke volumes about her success. But despite her polished appearance, there was an underlying unease in her eyes, a wariness that comes from living too many moments like the one she was about to endure. As she approached the hostess stand, her smile was warm but guarded. The hostess, a young woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a practiced smile, looked up and greeted her. "Good afternoon. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," the woman responded politely, her voice calm and steady. "It's under Davis. Samantha Davis." The hostess glanced at the screen in front of her, fingers tapping swiftly across the keyboard. A slight furrow appeared on her brow as she scanned the list. For a moment, it seemed as though she might claim the reservation didn't exist, a tactic Samantha was all too familiar with. But before any further words could be exchanged, the hostess's demeanor shifted. "Ah, yes, Ms. Davis. We have your table ready right this way." The hostess gestured towards a table near the center of the restaurant, a prime location. But as Samantha stepped forward to follow, her eyes caught the subtle exchange of glances between the hostess and a nearby waiter. The look in their eyes was one of thinly veiled judgment, the kind that Samantha had experienced her entire life, though it was often hidden behind the mask of politeness. It was a look that said, "What is she doing here?" Samantha's stomach tightened, but she ignored the creeping feeling of discomfort. She had been through worse, much worse. As she sat down, the waiter assigned to her table approached. His name tag read James, and his tall, lanky frame moved with the ease of someone who had worked in the service industry for years. He wore the same professional attire as the other waiters, but something about his posture, his expression felt off. He didn't meet her eyes, barely acknowledging her presence beyond the bare minimum required by his role. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of the warmth she had overheard him use with other diners. Samantha raised her head, meeting his gaze squarely. "Yes, I'll have a sparkling water, please," she said, her tone polite yet firm. James jotted it down without a word of acknowledgement. No smile, no hint of hospitality, just the cold efficiency of someone who didn't want to be there. Samantha noticed it all, the small slights, the subtle ways in which he treated her differently. She had noticed the warmth and friendliness he showed to the couple at the next table, who had arrived only moments before her. His entire demeanor had shifted when he greeted them. He had bent down, engaged them in conversation, and even made a joke that drew soft laughter from the pair. But with her, he was distant, detached, as though her presence was somehow an inconvenience. Samantha let out a quiet sigh as James walked away, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of the water glass placed before her. This wasn't new. It had been happening her entire life, in ways both large and small. The polite racism, the assumptions made about her because of the color of her skin. She had grown accustomed to the looks of surprise when she entered spaces where people like her were rarely seen. Wealthy, successful, black. In a world where people judged her before she even opened her mouth, she had learned to remain calm. to carry herself with dignity no matter what was thrown her way. But inside, it always stung. Every time. She glanced around the restaurant, taking in the faces of the other patrons. Mostly white, dressed in business attire or elegant casual wear, enjoying the comfort of knowing they belonged. A few looked in her direction, curious perhaps, but none held their gaze for long. She wondered how many of them noticed the difference in the way the staff treated her. Probably none. That was the thing about privilege. It made the everyday struggles of people like her invisible. Minutes passed before James returned with her sparkling water, placing it in front of her with a lackluster thud. He didn't offer to take her order yet, nor did he ask if she needed anything else. Instead, he seemed eager to move on to the next table, where another well-dressed couple awaited his attention. "Are you ready to order?" he asked, barely pausing to look at her. Samantha, maintaining her composure, nodded. "Yes, I'll have the grilled salmon with asparagus. And can I also get a side of your roasted potatoes, please?" James scribbled down the order, not bothering to ask how she preferred her salmon cooked, or if she needed anything else. His lack of interest was palpable, but Samantha didn't flinch. She had grown used to this, being served in a way that was functional but devoid of the warmth and attentiveness others received. The waiter left without another word, and Samantha sat in silence, watching the lively interactions happening around her. She could hear the laughter and friendly banter between waitstaff and customers, the clinking of glasses as people toasted to celebrations she wasn't a part of. The world continued to move around her, oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside her. Her thoughts drifted back to the countless other times she had found herself in situations like this, where she was either ignored or treated as though she didn't belong. There had been moments far worse than this, moments where the disrespect wasn't hidden behind professional politeness. But no matter how many times it happened, the sting of it never dulled. Still, she was not here to make a scene. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her upset. She was a woman of grace, and she knew how to handle herself in the face of indignity. Her actions would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. But she also knew something else. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And as the minutes ticked by, and the world around her continued to spin in its unrelenting normalcy, Samantha Davis sat in quiet reflection, preparing for the moment that would come next. A moment that, unbeknownst to those around her, would not only change the waiter's perspective, but leave an imprint far beyond the confines of this elegant restaurant. The low hum of conversation filled the air around Samantha, the lively atmosphere of the restaurant moving forward without pause. As she sipped her sparkling water, she could feel the weight of the stares, small fleeting glances from the waitstaff and nearby patrons, too subtle for anyone to call out, but there all the same. It was the kind of scrutiny she had come to know all too well. Quiet judgment disguised as curiosity, but she had long since learned to distinguish between the two. Her thoughts wandered to how often these moments had played out in her life. No matter her accomplishments, no matter how well she dressed, or how much she tried to blend into spaces like this, her skin color always seemed to set her apart. She could never simply exist in these environments without becoming a point of discussion, even if it was only whispered about or exchanged through knowing looks. The familiar feelings of discomfort and frustration swirled inside her, but she pushed them down as she had always done. Samantha had spent years perfecting the art of maintaining her poise, even when she felt anything but calm. It was a skill honed through experience, a survival mechanism in a world that often treated her with disdain, or worse, indifference. She set her water glass down, letting her fingers linger on its cool surface as she allowed herself a brief moment of introspection. Why had she come here today, to this particular restaurant? She didn't have to dine here. There were plenty of other places where she wouldn't have felt the same tension, the same pressure to prove that she belonged. But that was the point, wasn't it? Samantha had always believed in challenging the status quo, in pushing back against the unspoken boundaries that society tried to impose on people like her. She was successful, accomplished, and had every right to enjoy the same luxuries as anyone else. Why should she limit herself to places where she felt more comfortable, just because others couldn't see past the color of her skin? As these thoughts passed through her mind, she noticed James, the waiter, return to her table. His approach was casual, almost dismissive, as if her presence was an afterthought. He placed the plate of grilled salmon and asparagus in front of her with the same lack of enthusiasm he had shown before. There was no, "Enjoy your meal," no polite inquiry about whether she needed anything else. Just the bare minimum of service required to perform his job. "Here you go," he said flatly, before turning on his heel and walking away. Samantha stared at the plate in front of her, the tension in her shoulders tightening just a little more. It wasn't the food that bothered her. It looked fine, perfectly cooked and artfully presented. It was the way he had delivered it, with no warmth, no acknowledgement that she was more than just another body occupying space at one of his tables. She watched as James moved fluidly between other patrons, a smile on his face as he approached the next table. It was a young white couple, seated a few feet away from her, laughing softly as they perused the menu. When James arrived at their table, his demeanor changed completely. He bent down slightly, making eye contact with them, and spoke in a cheerful tone that was almost unrecognizable from the one he had used with her. "How are you folks doing today? Can I get you started with some drinks?" The couple smiled back at him, engaging in light banter. He laughed at something they said, making a quick joke in return, and the exchange lingered for a few moments longer than necessary. The difference in treatment was stark. There was a level of care and attention he afforded them that he hadn't even come close to offering Samantha. The bitterness rose inside her, unbidden, but impossible to ignore. This was how it always went. The subtle, almost imperceptible shift in energy depending on who was sitting in front of him. She had been polite, respectful, and yet she was treated as though she was invisible, undeserving of the basic courtesies that came so easily to others. But she wasn't invisible, and she certainly wasn't undeserving. Samantha pushed the thoughts aside, reminding herself once more that she hadn't come here for validation. She hadn't come here to be treated differently because of the biases of someone like James. She was here because she had earned her place in this world, just as much as anyone else. She picked up her fork and knife and began to eat, each bite a deliberate reminder that she was in control of this moment. Not James, not the other patrons who stole glances her way. Her. The minutes stretched on, and the meal passed in quiet contemplation. She ate slowly, savoring the taste of the food, even though the experience had been tainted by the undercurrent of discrimination. It wasn't the first time she had faced this kind of treatment, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier. Her mind drifted to her past, other restaurants, other encounters where she had felt this same discomfort. She thought about the time she had been denied service entirely, the manager claiming they were fully booked despite the abundance of empty tables in clear view, or the time a waiter had forgotten to bring her order for over an hour, only to serve it cold and with a dismissive apology when she finally asked about it. It wasn't always blatant racism. More often than not, it was the quieter moments like these, when the message wasn't spoken aloud but was delivered through body language, through the tone of voice, through the absence of the hospitality others received without question. But today was different. Today, Samantha wasn't going to walk away feeling defeated, carrying the weight of someone else's prejudice on her shoulders. She had made that decision the moment she had sat down. Today, she would do something that would leave an impact far greater than any confrontation ever could. As she finished her meal and placed her napkin neatly on the table, she signaled for the check. James approached, his expression unreadable, still avoiding eye contact. He placed the bill on the table with a quick, "Here you are," before stepping away again, not bothering to ask if she had enjoyed her meal or if there was anything else he could do for her. Samantha opened the small black folder, glancing at the total. It was exactly what she had expected, nothing unusual. She reached into her purse and pulled out her credit card, slipping it inside the folder before placing it back on the table for James to retrieve. But as she waited for him to return, a thought crossed her mind. one that brought the hint of a smile to her lips. It was time. When James finally returned with her card and the receipt, Samantha's demeanor shifted ever so slightly. She thanked him quietly and began to fill out the tip line on the receipt with steady, deliberate strokes. James, likely anticipating a standard tip, barely glanced her way. He offered a quick, obligatory, "Have a good day," before turning away to serve the next table. But Samantha wasn't done. Not yet. In that moment, as she finished filling out the receipt and placed it back in the folder, she knew her gesture wasn't about rewarding James for his lackluster service. It wasn't even about him. Not really. It was about reclaiming her power in a situation where it had been subtly stripped away. It was about making a statement, one that James would remember long after she walked out of this restaurant. Without another word, she stood up, collected her things, and calmly made her way to the exit. The sound of the restaurant carried on behind her as she walked out into the bright afternoon light. And there, at the heart of the bustling city, Samantha Davis smiled. She knew that her $1,000 tip had already set in motion something far greater than any words she could have spoken in that moment. The afternoon sun had begun to dip lower in the sky as Samantha stepped out of the restaurant, its warm rays casting long shadows on the busy sidewalk. A cool breeze swept through the air, carrying with it the faint sounds of the bustling city. Samantha paused for a moment outside the entrance, taking in a deep breath as she mentally prepared to leave this experience behind. The restaurant, the waiter, the subtle stings of disrespect, they all seemed to melt away as she began her walk toward the parking lot. Inside the restaurant, however, the world had not moved on quite so easily. James, oblivious to the significance of what had just transpired, continued about his routine, moving from table to table with the same detached professionalism. The young couple he had been serving earlier had just finished their meals and were now chatting contentedly as he brought them their check. He smiled at them, made a light joke, and thanked them for dining with them, his voice full of warmth and cheer. They smiled back, leaving him a generous tip as they prepared to leave. As James turned away from their table, his eyes wandered to the spot where Samantha had been sitting. The table was now empty, but the black folder with her receipt still lay there, untouched. He hadn't even noticed her leaving. There was something about her quiet departure that felt strange. Maybe it was the calmness with which she had carried herself throughout the meal, or maybe it was the way she had maintained her poise despite the coolness of the service she had received. He shrugged it off, walking over to the table to clear the place settings and collect the folder. Without much thought, he picked it up, ready to go about the usual routine of closing out the check and moving on to the next customer. It was just another table, just another transaction in a long line of them throughout the day. But when he opened the folder and saw the receipt, his hand froze mid-motion. There, written in bold, precise strokes on the tip line, was the number $1,000. For a moment, James stared at the receipt in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. $1,000. That couldn't be right. He blinked as if somehow expecting the numbers to change before his eyes, but they remained exactly as they were, stark and undeniable. His first thought was that it had to be a mistake. Maybe she had meant to write $10 and her hand had slipped, but as his eyes traveled further down the receipt, he saw her signature, neat, deliberate, and unwavering. There was no mistake. She had left him $1,000. James felt his heart race, a mix of confusion and shock bubbling up inside him. Why? Why would she do this? He hadn't gone out of his way to provide excellent service. In fact, if he was being honest with himself, he knew that his treatment of her had been lackluster at best. He had avoided engaging with her, had spoken to her in the barest of tones, and had barely made an effort to make her feel welcome. And yet, here he was, holding a receipt for $1,000 tip from her. It didn't make sense. James looked around the restaurant as if searching for some explanation, some clue as to why she would have done this. But there was nothing. Just the usual din of the restaurant, the soft clinking of plates and the murmur of conversation. No one else seemed to notice his bewilderment. No one else seemed to care. He turned the receipt over in his hands, his mind racing with questions. Had she left it as some sort of message? Was it meant to teach him a lesson? Or was it simply an act of kindness, one that he didn't deserve? James felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he considered the latter possibility. If it was kindness, then he had failed miserably. He thought back to the way he had treated her from the moment she walked in, how he had barely acknowledged her, how he had shown more attention and care to the other diners without even thinking twice about it. He hadn't been outright rude, but he hadn't been kind either. He had done just enough to get by, to do his job without really seeing her as a person. And now, staring at the tip in front of him, James couldn't help but feel a sense of guilt wash over him. She had done something so unexpected, so generous, and yet he had done nothing to earn it. In fact, he had done the opposite. A thought crossed his mind, one that made him even more uncomfortable. Would he have treated her differently if she hadn't been a black woman? Would he have given her the same care and attention that he gave to the other diners, the white couple who had received his full charm and service? James didn't want to believe that race had anything to do with it. He prided himself on being someone who treated everyone fairly, without prejudice. But now, in the stillness of this moment, he was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. It had everything to do with it. He hadn't even realized it at the time, but deep down, he knew that he had judged her the moment she walked in. Not consciously, perhaps, but it had been there, lurking in the back of his mind. The way she carried herself, the way she dressed. He had assumed things about her that he wouldn't have assumed about a white diner. And because of those assumptions, he had treated her as though she was somehow less deserving of his time, his energy, his respect. James felt a wave of shame rise up inside him, settling heavy in his chest. He had been so quick to judge her, and yet she had turned around and done something that left him completely speechless. Her tip wasn't just about money. It was a statement, one that forced him to confront his own biases, his own flaws. As he stood there, holding the receipt in his hands, James felt the world around him blur. The restaurant, the other diners, the sounds. They all seemed distant, muted, as if he was standing on the edge of something far greater than himself. The tip had been an act of grace, one that exposed the cracks in his own behavior, and now he couldn't ignore it. He glanced toward the entrance of the restaurant, half expecting her to walk back in, to explain herself, to tell him why she had done it. But she was gone, leaving him alone with his thoughts, his guilt, and the realization that he had a lot to learn about himself. For the rest of the evening, James moved through the motions of his job, but his mind was elsewhere. Every interaction, every exchange with the diners felt different now. He found himself thinking about how he spoke to them, how he looked at them, how he treated them. It was as though the $1,000 tip had opened a door inside him, one that he hadn't even known existed, and now that it had been opened, there was no closing it. As the restaurant began to wind down for the evening, James found himself lingering near the hostess stand, staring at the receipt one last time. The number glared back at him. 1,000. It was more money than he had ever received in a tip before, and yet it wasn't about the money at all. It was about the message, the lesson, the way it made him see the world differently. Before he clocked out for the night, he carefully folded the receipt and slipped it into his wallet. He didn't know why, but something told him that this was a moment he needed to remember, a moment that would stay with him long after the money was gone. And as James walked out of the restaurant that night, the cool evening air wrapping around him, he felt the weight of the day settle on his shoulders. The ripple effect had begun, and he knew that his life, his perspective, would never be the same again. James walked home that evening, the cool night air brushing against his face, but the usual comfort it brought felt distant. His footsteps echoed against the sidewalk, a rhythmic reminder of the lingering thoughts swirling in his mind. The day had unfolded in a way he never anticipated, leaving him not only confused but deeply unsettled. The streets were quieter now, and the city's evening hum had softened into the kind of background noise that would normally allow his mind to unwind after a long shift. But tonight, his thoughts refused to settle. Samantha's face kept appearing in his mind, her calm demeanor, her composed presence, and the shocking gesture of her $1,000 tip. How had he missed it? How had he failed to see her, really see her, until it was too late? As he reached his apartment, the reality of the evening felt heavier. His one-bedroom apartment was small, modest, just enough to get by. The walls were lined with framed prints of old cityscapes, and the kitchen still carried the faint smell of the leftover pizza he hadn't bothered to throw out before his shift. Normally, he would collapse onto the couch, throw on the TV, and allow the buzz of mindless entertainment to erase the stress of the day. But not tonight. Tonight, the silence felt like a mirror, reflecting the uncomfortable truths he had avoided for far too long. He placed his wallet on the small table near the door and hesitated for a moment. His hand hovered over it, the memory of slipping that receipt into it still fresh in his mind. It was more than just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, a reminder of the assumptions he had made about Samantha, about people like her. A quiet, nagging guilt stirred in him as he realized just how deep those assumptions ran. James picked up the wallet again and opened it. The receipt lay there, folded neatly, as if it were waiting for him to confront what it represented. He pulled it out and unfolded it slowly, staring at the bold handwriting where Samantha had written the $1,000 tip. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The absurdity of it struck him again. Why had she done it? What was she trying to say? James walked over to his couch, sitting down with the receipt still in his hands. His mind traveled back to the beginning of his shift, replaying every moment. The way he had greeted her, cold, indifferent, uninterested. He had sized her up the moment she walked through the door, dismissing her without realizing it. There was no specific insult, no outright offense, but his neglect had been just as impactful. He had treated her as less without even meaning to, and she had known it. He rubbed his temples, trying to make sense of the knot forming in his chest. It wasn't that James thought of himself as a racist. He had always prided himself on being a good person, someone who didn't judge others based on race or appearance. But as he sat there, the truth he had been avoiding finally broke through. It wasn't about whether or not he saw himself as racist. It was about the small, everyday actions, the subtle ways in which his behavior had been shaped by biases he never wanted to acknowledge. The way he had treated Samantha wasn't about active malice. It was about the indifference that came from years of absorbing the quiet messages of society. Messages that said people like her didn't belong in certain spaces. Messages that said people like him didn't need to go out of their way to make them feel welcome. And as much as he didn't want to admit it, those messages had shaped him, shaped the way he interacted with people like her. James stared at the ceiling, the weight of the realization settling deeper. He had always thought of racism as something obvious, something blatant, but tonight had taught him a different lesson. Racism wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was silent. It was in the small decisions, who you greet with a smile, who you offer better service to, and who you dismiss with nothing more than a passing glance. His mind replayed her calm composure throughout the evening. Samantha had every right to complain, to demand better service, to confront him for the way he had treated her. But she hadn't. She had simply remained gracious, even though it was clear she had noticed every slight, every moment of indifference. And instead of lashing out, she had left him that $1,000 tip, a gesture that felt more like a lesson than a reward. James shook his head, his hands tightening around the edges of the receipt. She had seen him, really seen him, and had responded in a way that exposed his shortcomings without uttering a single word. He wasn't sure if he could have done the same in her position. He wasn't sure if he had that kind of grace. The silence in the apartment felt louder now, more pressing, as James thought about how many other times he had let his unconscious biases guide his actions. How many other customers had he treated the same way? How many other people had walked into his life, only for him to dismiss them without realizing it? It wasn't just about Samantha. It was about all the moments before her that had gone unnoticed, unchecked. James looked down at the receipt one more time before folding it and placing it back into his wallet. He knew that tonight wasn't just going to be another night that he could forget about by the time morning came. The $1,000 tip wasn't about the money. It was about the wake-up call that had come with it. He got up from the couch, heading to his bedroom, but the thoughts kept swirling in his mind. He needed to do something, to process what had just happened. And for the first time in a long while, he felt compelled to change, not just in a superficial way, but deeply, fundamentally. Before he lay down for the night, James picked up his phone and opened the browser. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to start, but eventually typed in a search. Unconscious bias in customer service. Dozens of articles, studies, and resources appeared on the screen. He scrolled through them, his eyes catching on headlines that spoke directly to what he had experienced today. How implicit bias affects customer interactions, microaggressions in everyday service, and understanding the quiet racism in service industries. James clicked on the first article and began to read, the words washing over him in a way that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. It was as though he was seeing the world through a different lens now, one that made him painfully aware of the things he had never noticed before. As he read, the hours ticked by. The world outside continued to move forward, but for James, the weight of what had happened tonight stayed with him. It was a quiet reckoning, a confrontation with himself that he had never expected. And though he wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, one thing was certain. He couldn't go back to the way things were before. He wouldn't. The next morning, James awoke feeling an unfamiliar sense of heaviness in his chest. Normally, the break of dawn would bring the same routine, a quick shower, breakfast hastily thrown together, and then off to the restaurant for another long day of serving. But today, there was something different. The events of the previous night still lingered at the forefront of his mind, refusing to be brushed aside like a bad dream. His encounter with Samantha, her quiet grace, and that $1,000 tip, everything weighed on him in a way that no amount of coffee or routine could shake. As he sat on the edge of his bed, staring down at his worn-out sneakers, James felt the enormity of what had happened settling deeper into his bones. It wasn't just about a single encounter anymore. It was about what that encounter had revealed about him, about the world he lived in, and about the way he had been moving through it for years. There was no hiding from it now, no pretending that his indifference the night before was just a one-time lapse in judgment. James took a deep breath, trying to figure out what to do next. How did one even begin to confront years of ingrained biases? How could he change something that had been so deeply embedded in his subconscious? The questions swirled in his mind, each one pulling him deeper into reflection. But the answers, those were still out of reach. He thought about the articles he had read the night before, about unconscious bias and the ways it seeped into everyday interactions without people even realizing it. He had never considered himself someone who held those kinds of prejudices, but now he knew better. The realization stung, more than he wanted to admit, but it was also necessary. If nothing else, Samantha's act of kindness had forced him to take a long, hard look in the mirror, and what he saw wasn't pretty. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his manager, a reminder of the lunch shift he was scheduled to work in a few hours. James stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, contemplating whether or not to respond. The idea of going back to the restaurant felt overwhelming, almost suffocating. How could he walk back into that place, knowing what he now knew about himself, about the way he had been treating people? But he had to. Running away from it wouldn't solve anything. With a resigned sigh, James typed a quick response, confirming that he'd be there for his shift. He stood up from the bed, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each step forward required an extra measure of effort. He wasn't just preparing for another day of work. He was preparing to face the consequences of the introspection that had taken root in him. When James arrived at the restaurant, the familiar sights and sounds greeted him. The polished floors, the hum of conversations, the steady flow of customers. It was all the same as before. But to James, everything felt different now. He couldn't move through the space with the same ease. the same detached professionalism that had once been his hallmark. The faces of the customers no longer blurred together as they usually did. Now, each face stood out to him. Each interaction held weight. He could no longer ignore the subtle ways in which he treated people differently based on their appearance. The young white professionals who came in for lunch, the older couples enjoying a quiet meal, the families out for a special occasion. He had always greeted them with the same polished smile, the same practiced charm. But when someone who didn't fit the mold came through the door, his demeanor shifted. It wasn't intentional, but it was undeniable. James tried to push the thoughts away as he clocked in and put on his apron, but they clung to him, making it impossible to slip back into the rhythm of work without noticing the cracks in his behavior. His eyes flickered to the tables, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Part of him hoped that Samantha might walk through the door again, but he knew that was unlikely. And even if she did, what would he say? How could he possibly explain what had been swirling in his mind since the moment she left? The lunch rush began, and soon James found himself back in the flow of things. But something had shifted. He could no longer move through his tasks on autopilot. Each interaction felt weighted with the knowledge that he had gained from the night before. At one point during the shift, an older black couple walked in, taking a seat near the back of the restaurant. James felt a strange tightening in his chest as he noticed them. He recognized the moment for what it was, an opportunity to make things right, to treat them with the care and respect they deserved, the care and respect he hadn't given Samantha. He approached their table, his heart pounding in his chest as he prepared to greet them. The man dressed in a tailored suit and the woman in a bright, elegant scarf. Both smiled warmly as they picked up the menus. James forced a smile in return, but inside his nerves were frayed. He wanted to get this right. "Good afternoon," James said, his voice steady but tentative. "Welcome to our restaurant. Can I start you off with some drinks today?" The woman looked up from the menu and smiled. "Yes, please, I'll have a glass of sparkling water." "And I'll have an iced tea," the man added, giving James a polite nod. As James jotted down their order, he felt the weight of his actions from the night before pressing down on him. He had been so blind, so careless, with how he treated people, and now, standing in front of this couple, he realized just how much his behavior mattered. It wasn't just about the food he served or how quickly he refilled a drink. It was about how he made people feel. It was about seeing them, really seeing them, as human beings with the same dignity and respect he would want for himself. When he returned with their drinks, James made an extra effort to engage with them, asking about their day, listening to their responses, and making sure they had everything they needed. It wasn't about overcompensating. It was about being genuine, about treating them with the kindness and attentiveness that they deserved. As the meal progressed, James found himself more relaxed, more at ease in their company. He realized that this wasn't about proving anything to them. It was about proving something to himself. As they finished their meal and prepared to leave, the woman looked up at James with a soft smile. "Thank you for your service today. We really appreciated it." James nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "It was my pleasure," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As the couple left, James stood there for a moment, watching them walk out of the restaurant. For the first time since the previous night, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe he couldn't undo what had happened with Samantha, but he could learn from it. He could change. And in that small, seemingly ordinary interaction, he had taken the first step. Later that evening, as James was cleaning up after the shift, his mind wandered back to Samantha once again. He wondered what she had thought as she left the restaurant. Did she know the impact her tip had already made on him? Did she intend to teach him this lesson, or had she simply moved on with her life, leaving him to grapple with the weight of his own actions? There were no easy answers, but one thing was clear. Her act of kindness had set something in motion inside him. It had forced him to confront his own biases, to look at the world through a different lens, and to realize that change wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about the small, everyday choices that shaped how he moved through the world. As James finished wiping down the last table, He felt a sense of resolve building inside him. This wasn't going to be a one-time realization. It was going to be a journey, one that would require him to stay vigilant, to keep questioning himself, and to keep learning. It was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. He glanced around the empty restaurant, the silence settling around him like a gentle reminder of the lessons he still had to learn. And as he turned off the lights and walked out into the cool night air once again, James knew that he was no longer the same person who had walked into this restaurant the day before. The seeds of change had been planted, and now it was up to him to nurture them. The next few days passed in a blur for James. His shift at the restaurant continued as usual, but nothing felt quite the same. His interactions with customers were different now, sharper, more deliberate. The carelessness that had once defined his work had been replaced by an almost hyper-awareness, as if every action, every word, held far more weight than before. He noticed things he hadn't before, like the subtle ways in which customers responded to his tone, the way they glanced at him when he greeted them, or how quickly they shifted their demeanor depending on his attitude. It was exhausting in a way, this constant self-monitoring, but it was also necessary. At night, when the restaurant was closed and the silence of his small apartment crept in, James found himself replaying his interactions with customers in his mind. He scrutinized every detail, asking himself whether he had been fair, whether he had shown respect to everyone equally, whether he had let his unconscious biases creep in. The weight of self-reflection was new to him, an unsettling process that left him questioning not only his professional life but also his personal values. It was as if the confrontation with his own prejudice had opened a door that couldn't be closed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how deep those biases ran, not just in his work but in the world around him. Every news headline, every interaction on the street, every casual remark from a friend or colleague, it was all tainted by the same subtle, insidious discrimination that he had been blind to for so long. He saw it now, not just in himself, but everywhere, and it was overwhelming. One night after a particularly grueling shift, James sat in the dim light of his apartment, staring out of the window at the city below. The glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car gave the illusion of life moving forward as it always had. But for James, it felt as if the world had stopped. The silence was heavy, pressing down on him as his thoughts continued to swirl. He hadn't been able to get Samantha out of his mind. What was she doing now? Had she thought about him at all after leaving that $1,000 tip? Or had he simply been another fleeting encounter in her life, another moment of injustice she had learned to brush off with grace? James couldn't shake the feeling that he had to do something, to find a way to make things right. But how could he? Samantha was gone, and he didn't know anything about her except her name. There was no way to track her down, no way to apologize or explain what he had been going through since she left. He had failed her in that moment, and now the weight of that failure sat heavily on his chest, refusing to let him move on. The sound of his phone buzzing on the table broke through the quiet, snapping James out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen, a message from his manager, reminding him of the upcoming staff meeting at the restaurant. James groaned inwardly. The last thing he wanted right now was to sit through another meeting filled with discussions about shifts and sales targets. But there was no avoiding it. Work was work, and he had responsibilities to fulfill. The next morning, James arrived at the restaurant early, the air still crisp with the remnants of the night before. He walked in, greeted by the familiar sound of the kitchen staff prepping for the day and the clatter of dishes being set up for service. The dining area was quiet, a stark contrast to the bustle it would soon become during lunch hours. As the staff gathered for the meeting, James took his usual seat in the back, hoping to keep a low profile. His manager, a stout man in his late 40s with a booming voice and an overly cheerful demeanor, began the meeting with the usual updates, new menu items, revised seating arrangements, and a reminder to push the day's specials. It was the same routine they went through at every meeting, but today James could barely focus on the words. His mind drifted, his thoughts once again consumed by Samantha. He remembered how she had sat so calmly at her table, how she had maintained her dignity despite the disrespect she faced. And then, without warning, something his manager said jolted him back to reality. "And one more thing," the manager said, his voice carrying a note of seriousness that caught James's attention. "I've been getting some feedback from customers about the service lately, and I want to remind everyone that how we treat our guests matters. We've had a few complaints, nothing major, but people notice when they're not being treated with respect. I don't need to remind you that in this business, perception is everything." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Complaints? He wondered if any of those complaints had been about him, about how he had treated Samantha. Had she left feedback after all? The thought made his stomach churn. He hadn't been outright rude, but he knew better now. Disrespect didn't always have to be loud. It could be quiet, subtle, almost invisible, but just as hurtful. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur, the manager's words echoing in James's head long after the meeting ended. He needed to talk to someone, to make sense of everything that had been stirring inside him. But who? Most of his co-workers were friendly enough, but none of them would understand what he was going through. They'd dismiss it as overthinking, or worse, tell him it wasn't that big of a deal. After the meeting, James found himself lingering in the restaurant, his feet carrying him toward the back, where the hostess stand was set up. His co-worker, Lisa, was standing there, flipping through the reservations list for the day. She glanced up as he approached, raising an eyebrow in mild surprise. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, her voice casual as she continued scanning the list. James hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. Lisa wasn't exactly his closest friend at work, but she had always been straightforward, no nonsense. If anyone would give him an honest answer, it would be her. "Can I ask you something?" James said, his voice quieter than usual. Lisa looked up from the list, her expression softening a little as she caught the serious tone in his voice. "Sure. What's going on?" James shifted uncomfortably, leaning against the stand as he spoke. "Have you ever felt like you didn't treat someone the way they deserved to be treated? Like maybe you didn't realize it in the moment, but later on you look back and think, 'Man, I really screwed up.'" Lisa frowned slightly, setting the list aside. "I mean, I guess we all have moments like that," she replied, her tone cautious. "Why? Did something happen?" James exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't planned on spilling everything, but now that he had started, it felt like he couldn't stop. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a few days ago. There was this woman, and I didn't give her the kind of service I should have. I didn't realize it at the time, but now I can't stop thinking about it. She ended up leaving a huge tip, like $1,000, and I don't know why. I didn't deserve it." Lisa blinked, clearly taken aback by the amount. $1,000? Seriously? James nodded, feeling the weight of the receipt in his mind all over again. "Yeah, and the thing is, she didn't say anything. She didn't call me out or complain or anything like that. She just left, and now I'm stuck wondering what kind of person I am that I didn't see it until after she was gone." Lisa was quiet for a moment, processing what James had said. She leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Sounds like she was trying to teach you something," she said finally, her voice measured. "I mean, look, I don't know exactly what went down, but it sounds like you've already learned the lesson. That's more than most people would do. A lot of folks would just take the money and move on." James let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I don't think I can move on that easily. It feels like there's something more I need to do. I just don't know what." Lisa shrugged slightly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about what you do now. It's about what you carry with you from this point on. You can't go back and fix what happened, but you can make sure it doesn't happen again." James fell silent, her words sinking in. She was right. He couldn't undo what had already been done, but he could make sure that every interaction, every decision he made going forward was different, better. And maybe that was the only way to make things right. The days turned into weeks, but the memory of that encounter stayed with James like a shadow, following him through every shift, every interaction, every conversation. His world felt different now. The seemingly simple routine of waiting tables had taken on new meaning, and every time a new customer walked through the door, James found himself questioning the assumptions he made about them. Each order he took, each drink he poured, was now tinged with the quiet urgency to be better, to make sure he never treated anyone the way he had treated Samantha. But the weight of self-awareness was heavier than he had anticipated. James had always thought of himself as a good person, fair, respectful, someone who didn't see color or judge others based on their appearance. But now he knew better. The subtle biases he had carried all his life, the ones he hadn't even realized were there, had bubbled to the surface, and now he couldn't escape them. He wasn't sure if it was guilt or something deeper that made him so hyper-aware of his actions now. But every shift felt like an opportunity for redemption, a chance to prove, to himself more than anyone else, that he could change. He could be different. And yet, with every new interaction, there was an undeniable tension that made the process feel like a delicate balancing act. One day, as James was cleaning up after the lunch rush, he found himself lost in thought once again. The restaurant had emptied out, and the lingering scent of food and coffee mixed with the soft sound of music playing in the background. His movements were automatic, wiping down tables, straightening chairs, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in the loop of self-reflection that had become all too familiar. He thought about the many times he had served customers without really seeing them, the countless moments where he had gone through the motions without considering the person sitting in front of him. He wondered how many people had left his tables feeling unseen, unimportant. It wasn't just about Samantha. It was about everyone who had ever walked through those doors expecting to be treated with respect and instead received indifference. As he worked, the manager, Frank, approached him, his voice breaking through the haze of James's thoughts. "James, got a minute?" Frank's tone was casual, but there was something in his expression that made James pause. "Sure, what's up?" James asked, wiping his hands on his apron as he straightened up. Frank gestured for him to follow, leading him toward the back office. James felt a slight tightening in his chest as he followed, unsure of what was coming next. He hadn't done anything wrong, at least not recently, but there was always that lingering anxiety that came with being called into a manager's office. Once inside, Frank leaned against his desk, crossing his arms over his chest. The office was small, cluttered with papers and files, and the faint hum of the air conditioner filled the room. Frank didn't speak right away, and the silence stretched on just long enough to make James uncomfortable. "Listen," Frank began, his tone measured. "I've noticed something with you lately. You've been different these past few weeks. I don't know if it's something personal going on, or if you're just in a rut, but it's starting to show." James felt a flicker of panic rise up in his chest. Was he about to get reprimanded for not performing up to standard? He had been trying so hard to be better, to treat people with the respect they deserved. But maybe he had been overthinking it. Maybe in trying so hard to change, he had been messing up in other ways. Frank must have noticed the tension in James's face because he quickly added, "I'm not saying you're doing a bad job. In fact, you've been solid. The customers like you and you're still one of our best servers. But I can tell something's weighing on you. I just want to make sure you're okay." James wasn't sure how to respond. He hadn't expected this conversation, and he certainly hadn't been prepared to explain what had been going on in his mind these past few weeks. I guess I've just been thinking a lot lately," James said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "About the way I treat people, the way I've been moving through the world. It's hard to explain, but something happened a while back that made me realize I wasn't as fair as I thought I was." Frank's eyebrows lifted slightly, curiosity sparking in his eyes. "What do you mean?" James hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to share. But then he thought of Samantha, of the $1,000 tip, of the way she had changed him without even knowing it, and he knew he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. "A few weeks ago, A woman came in and I didn't treat her right, James admitted, his voice quiet. I didn't say anything rude, and I didn't do anything outright disrespectful, but I treated her differently. I didn't give her the same service I gave to the other customers, and it wasn't until after she left a $1,000 tip, that I realized what I had done. Frank's expression softened, his usual stern demeanor giving way to something more thoughtful. He didn't interrupt, allowing James to continue. It made me think about how I've been treating people, especially people who don't fit the usual mold of our clientele, James went on. I've been trying to do better since then, but it's not easy. It's like I'm constantly questioning everything I do, and I don't know if I'm getting it right. Frank was silent for a moment, his eyes focused on James with an intensity that made him feel both exposed and relieved. Finally, Frank let out a long breath and spoke. You know, I've been in this business a long time, Frank began, his voice low but steady. And I've seen a lot of things, good and bad. It's easy to fall into patterns, to think you're treating everyone the same when really you're not. But the fact that you're thinking about it, that you're questioning yourself, that means you're already on the right path. James nodded, feeling a small sense of relief wash over him. But it wasn't enough to quiet the gnawing doubt that had been following him for weeks. I just don't want to be the person who makes someone feel like they don't belong, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've seen it happen too many times, and I never thought I'd be the one doing it. Frank's gaze softened even more, and he stood up from his desk, walking over to stand next to James. Look, we all have blind spots. No one's perfect. But the important thing is that you're willing to look at those blind spots and do something about them, Frank said, his tone encouraging. You can't change what happened, but you can make sure it doesn't happen again. And if that woman left you a tip like that, it means she saw something in you, something worth changing for. James nodded, his heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. He wasn't sure if he fully believed Frank's words, but they gave him hope. Maybe there was something in him worth changing for. As the conversation ended, James felt a sense of quiet resolve settle over him. He wasn't finished grappling with the internal struggle that had begun weeks ago, but he was starting to see a way forward. It wasn't about fixing everything at once. It was about taking one step at a time, learning from his mistakes and making sure that each day he treated every person who walked through the restaurant's doors with the dignity and respect they deserved. That evening, after his shift ended, James sat down at his small dining table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He stared down at the receipt he had been holding on to for so long, the one with Samantha's $1,000 tip. It was worn now, the edges frayed from being folded and unfolded countless times. But the significance of that gesture hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger with time. James carefully placed the receipt in a small envelope, sealing it with a quiet sense of finality. He wasn't going to throw it away, he couldn't, but he didn't need to carry it with him everywhere anymore. He had learned the lesson, and now it was time to move forward. The next day would bring new customers, new interactions, and new challenges. But for the first time in weeks, James felt ready. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of James's apartment, casting soft rays across the room as he sat quietly at the kitchen table. The envelope containing Samantha's receipt rested in front of him. It was a symbol of everything he had been carrying these past few weeks: his guilt, his shame, and his desire to be better. But now, it was also a reminder that he could change, that he had the power to treat people with the respect and care they deserved, even if he had failed in the past. Today felt different. James wasn't entirely sure why, but there was a sense of clarity that had begun to settle over him. Maybe it was the conversation with Frank, or maybe it was the slow realization that change didn't happen all at once. Whatever the reason, James felt more at peace than he had in weeks. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened with Samantha, but he also knew that he couldn't let that moment define him. Instead, he had to use it as fuel to move forward, to become the person he had always thought he was, but hadn't yet fully become. It wasn't about being perfect, it was about being aware, being intentional, and doing better every day. As he prepared for his shift, James took a deep breath, a sense of determination rising within him. Today would be a new day, a chance to start fresh, to make things right in the only way he could, by treating every person who walked through those restaurant doors with the respect, care, and attention they deserved. When James arrived at the restaurant, the usual morning rush was already underway. The kitchen was alive with the sounds of sizzling food, the clattering of pans, and the steady hum of conversation between the chefs and servers. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, mingling with the chatter of customers settling in for their meals. James greeted his co-workers with a small nod, slipping into the familiar rhythm of the morning prep. But unlike the days before, his mind was clearer now, no longer weighed down by the constant overthinking that had plagued him. He wasn't perfect, he knew that. But he was here, and he was ready to do his job with the awareness and respect he had been lacking before. As the first customers of the day began to trickle in, James felt a calm settle over him. The small interactions that had once felt overwhelming now seemed manageable, even meaningful. Each time he greeted a new customer, he made sure to look them in the eye, to offer a genuine smile, and to listen, to really listen to what they wanted. It wasn't about overcompensating for past mistakes. It was about being present, being human. Around noon, as the lunch rush reached its peak, James noticed a familiar face walking through the door. It was Lisa, his co-worker, coming in for her shift. She spotted him and waved, making her way over to the hostess stand where she would be working the lunch crowd. As she approached, James felt a pang of gratitude for the conversation they had shared a few days earlier. It had helped him more than he had realized at the time. "Hey, how's it going?" Lisa asked, her voice light as she slipped into her usual spot at the stand. "Better," James replied with a small smile. "Thanks for the talk the other day, it really helped." Lisa gave him a knowing nod, her expression softening. "I'm glad. Just remember, we're all figuring this stuff out. No one expects you to have all the answers." James chuckled lightly. "Yeah, I'm starting to get that." With a final nod, Lisa turned her attention to the growing line of customers, and James returned to his tables. The lunch rush was in full swing now, and the restaurant buzzed with activity. Orders came in fast, and James found himself juggling multiple tasks at once, taking orders, refilling drinks, clearing tables. But this time, there was no sense of panic, no overwhelming urge to question every move he made. He simply did his job, one step at a time, treating each customer with the same level of care and attention. Halfway through the shift, as James was clearing a table near the window, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to read the menu. Her glasses perched precariously on the edge of her nose, and she squinted at the small print, her frustration evident. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice tinged with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. "I'm having a bit of trouble reading this. Do you mind helping me?" James smiled warmly, stepping closer to her table. "Of course. What would you like to know about? I can read it out for you." The woman's face softened with relief. "Oh, thank you. I'm not sure what to order, but I was thinking of something light. Maybe a salad?" James went over the menu with her, describing each option in detail until she made her decision. When she finally settled on the house salad with grilled chicken, she looked up at him with genuine gratitude in her eyes. "You've been so kind," she said softly. "Thank you." "It's my pleasure," James replied, feeling a warmth spread through him. As he walked away to put in her order, James felt something shift inside him. These small moments, these quiet acts of service, they were the reason he had taken this job in the first place. It wasn't just about serving food or clearing tables. It was about making people feel seen, feel cared for, even in the smallest of ways. The rest of the day passed smoothly, and by the time James clocked out, he felt a sense of satisfaction that had been missing for so long. It wasn't a grand moment of redemption, but it didn't need to be. Redemption, he realized, wasn't something that happened all at once. It was a process, a series of small, deliberate choices that added up over time. That evening, James sat on the balcony of his apartment, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He sipped a cup of tea, the cool breeze ruffling his hair as he reflected on the day. It had been a good day, not perfect, but good. He had treated people the way they deserved to be treated, and in doing so, he had started to heal some of the guilt that had been weighing on him for so long. He thought of Samantha again, wondering where she was, what she was doing. He wondered if she had any idea how much she had changed his life with that simple act of kindness. Her grace had been a mirror, forcing him to see himself in a way he never had before. And for that, he would always be grateful. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. For a moment, he scrolled aimlessly through his contacts, his mind wandering. Then, almost on instinct, he opened a blank message and began to type. "Thank you." He didn't know if he would ever get the chance to send it, didn't know if Samantha would ever read those words. But writing them felt like the first step toward closure, the first step toward letting go of the guilt and embracing the change that had taken root in him. And as James sat there, watching the city hum quietly below, he knew that he had taken his first real step on the path to redemption. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building a better future, one choice at a time. What started as a simple meal turned into a lesson that goes far beyond a restaurant. Samantha's grace in the face of disrespect didn't just change one person's perspective. It challenges all of us to look deeper at how we treat others. This story isn't just about a waiter's reaction. It's about the quiet power of kindness, even when it's not deserved. We all have the ability to make a difference in someone's life, whether through a word, a gesture, or simply seeing someone for who they truly are. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and subscribe so you never miss more inspiring stories just like this one. And if you think this was powerful, wait until you see our next video, where a stranger's small act of kindness sets off a chain reaction that changes an entire community. You won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and remember, it's the small actions that often make the biggest impact.